We are headquartered in Chicago, but we're really a distributed team. Pretty much we have people working in all 4 time zones of the US, people in Canada, people in Europe, and various other parts of the world. If you're thinking our name sounds familiar, I think we've been a sponsor at Drupal GovCon since pretty much day one. And we're also a sponsor at DrupalCon every year, and we participate at various camps around the country. I'm actually coming to you from, I live in Richmond, Virginia, but I'm actually down in Florida for Florida Drupal camp right now. And then just some of our government clients. I am not going to go through all of these, but I do want to highlight 2 because they're relatively recent launches. GAO.gov, we just launched them on Drupal 8 last week. So if you have not seen their website recently, the previous one had been around since like 2007. So it's a dramatic change going from no content management system at all to Drupal 8. And also the U.S. District Court, Southern District of New York, which is one of the bigger, sort of busier federal court districts. And we launched them on Drupal 8 late last year. So why is this important now? So if you're not aware, Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 will both transition to end-of-life status in November of 2021, assuming everything stays on schedule. What that means is after that date hits, there'll be no more security updates, no more patches, no more module work, etc., coming from Drupal.org or contributors. There will be commercial support options. So if for some reason, just from timing and not being able to get everything done, your agency has to still be on Drupal 7 or 8, after November 2021. You'll have some commercial support options, but they're not going to be free anymore. They're going to cost, and they're probably not going to be as comprehensive because you're going to have one vendor doing it versus the 100,000 person strong Drupal community focused on it. So if we do the math, that's about 20 months from today. So if you start thinking about how long it takes a federal agency to migrate a major site to D8 or D9, or to go through the procurement process to get a vendor on board and get them onboarded and working and get the work done, you can see that we're getting pretty close to a critical time crunch here, probably for any government entity of any significant size, in terms of actually having the site launched and sort of completely beta tested and QA'd in production and stable by November 2021. So it's just something to keep in mind if it sounds like that date is far off. It kind of is, but then it kind of isn't in government time for a lot of people. So it's sort of the high level. So what are some of the key challenges you're going to hit in a migration from, really from anything to Drupal 8 or 9, but in particular from Drupal 6, 7, or 8, going up to 9. Content migration, which is what we're going to primarily focus on for the rest of this presentation. How you take your content that is in Drupal now or some other CMS or no CMS and prepare it and get it into Drupal. There's no migration path for views. So if you've got a bunch of, if your current Drupal website relies heavily on views, just plan for the fact that they're going to have to all be rewritten. Obviously, all your custom modules are going to have to be rewritten or abandoned if they can now be handled with core or contributed module. Contributed modules from Drupal 7 may or may not have an upgrade path. It varies. Hacked modules obviously won't have an upgrade path. So if you've got a module that you hacked back in 2014 because you didn't have any better options and it's been running fine ever since, you're going to have to give it up when you move up to Drupal 8 or Drupal 8/9. We've completely changed the templating engine in Drupal, so all your themes must be rewritten. Multilingual content is handled completely differently in Drupal 8 than it was in Drupal 7. So if you have a lot of multilingual content in your site, most likely that's going to have to migrate manually. Also, Drupal 8 was kind of a complete rewrite from the ground up in the first place. It's much more reliant on object-oriented principles. Drupal 7, I think a lot of people learn sort of by downloading it themselves and just sort of learning as they go until they became really proficient at it. Drupal 8, I think, is less kind of built to enable that. It has an assumption of, I think, more of you're coming into it with a background in content management systems or software development. So that also leads into the final bullet point, which is if you've got a Drupal 7 team now and you're moving to Drupal 8/9, you're probably going to need some kind of formal training to kind of get them up to speed on what's different. So those are just some things to be thinking about as you're thinking about your migration. And with that, I will turn it over to Aaron, let him take it from here.
Great. Yeah, one thing maybe to add about that is in a lot of ways, in terms of like developer perspective, this is really a great time to move to Drupal 8. If you wanted to migrate, 2 or 3 years ago, a lot of the modules weren't ready. There were a lot of bugs have been fixed since the initial release of Drupal 8. So from a developer experience perspective and a feature perspective, now's a great time to do the switch. So in planning a migration,
let me say, go ahead. Quick, if anybody has any questions, please use the chat to ask them, so that later on at the end of the presentation, Aaron or Chris can address those. Sorry to interrupt.
Hang on.
Chris, you
you
lost your.
I know. I'm trying to find it. It vanished. There it goes.
Alt tab. Great. Right. So when starting migration, you first want one of the key first things is to do a content audit. And one of the key questions in a content audit is what content do you want to keep from your old site? Some of the ways that you can analyze that are, is the content old? Is it older than a year? Is it older than 5 years? In terms of SEO, old content isn't always valuable. Is it popular? If you're, one of the things that we often suggest for folks that are looking at their content, like if folks aren't visiting it, you might not want it. It might not be worthwhile to go to the trouble of migrating. So often looking at your first 100 visited pages is a good place to start in terms of what is the currently your most valuable content, and then is the content redundant? Does information exist in a couple places? You'd be surprised, especially if you have a site that's been that's had content for a long time. We're currently working with a client that had content that's a 10-year-old system, and right away we saw content being duplicated in a couple of places, and some of it was actually not accurate. So there was not only redundant, but conflicting content. Some of the tools that you can use for that are Google, your analytics tool. Google Analytics is pretty ubiquitous, but there's a lot of different analytics tools. You can use a broken link checker, or you can use the existing metadata to start to look through your content. Should I read the questions as they come in, or
it's up to you.
Okay.
You may want to wait, get through your presentation, and then address them at the end.
Sounds great. Next slide.
Okay, I just want to add one thing to this too. The next slide. Since I tend to work with a lot of our clients, the trend I've seen is with current redesigns, whether it's to Drupal or not, actually, is try to cut back. I mean, I think there was a period of time there where everyone was like, just throw everything you have on the web. It might be valuable to somebody, and I think that trend's reversed. And we've seen a lot of, the city of Bloomington, Indiana did a presentation at DrupalCon, I think 2 years ago, about how they went from like 4,000 pages down to 400 without actually losing anything valuable on the site. So I think the trend is now to sort of, really think hard about, does it need to be a part of the website? And try to make sure that everything on the site is valuable instead of it being just sort of a a storehouse of stuff that may or may not be valuable.
Yep. So Chris asks, what about government sites that may need to keep older content as a public record, which is a great question, and segues well into the next step, which is a content strategy. How does the content affect the mission of your organization? So a lot of folks are SEO drives their the value of their content. Are you getting revenue from ad clicks? Are you getting content? Are you getting engagement through your content? The SEO is usually less significant to government. So you might have a regulatory reason for publishing content. You might have an API that you need to, or reports that you need to publish, and so that will help drive your content strategy. And then a lot of government are providing access to services. I helped the New York DMV is on Drupal and helped with that site build, and their main mandate was to increase the number of users that are not going to their local DMV, and that was the strategy that really drove the whole project. So they actually, it's funny just that they just didn't want to see people as frequently, but it's much more valuable for people to be able to get the access to those services online. So that your strategy will around your content will help be driven by how it affects how the value of it affects your mission. Next slide. So in terms of design considerations, where you're coming from is going to help dictate the strategy for the migration. If folks are coming from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, they are likely in a better place than if you're migrating from a bespoke system or elsewhere, in that it's likely if you were using Drupal 7, you're using fields and content types, so there is some existing structure to your data. Though you'd be surprised that especially Drupal 7 sites that were built by folks with less experience or early on in the Drupal 7 timeline, that folks tend to put all of their content in the block field, or the body field. So even though they're coming from a content management system like Drupal that really supports well structure, when they go to migrate, they don't. Their content isn't as structured. Next. So one of the things that can help, especially in both, so this will help both from a design perspective to have a style guide, but also from the developer and site building perspective. A good style guide is something that will help inform how the structured content is going to be stored, how it's going to be presented. So that's a valuable tool as you're designing your migration. Next slide. Another thing to consider in moving to Drupal 8 is that the storage and presentation layer might be different. Drupal 8, there's several different ways of storing both content and the presentation of it. So you might use fields, views heavily in view modes. Paragraphs is another paradigm that's very popular in terms of both storage and widget building. And now that Layout Builder has recently landed in core, there's now another paradigm there for site building using Layout Builder and content blocks. So thinking through how you're going to store and present the data is going to help in your migration planning. Next slide. So content governance is another thing to think through. Are your roles and permissions the same? Are your workflows the same? Drupal 7 had powerful workflow tools like Drupal 8. Are those going to be the same? That's not something that would migrate directly, but as Chris pointed out, all of those modules have changed. But as you're moving to the new system, that's something that you need to ask up front, because if you didn't have a workflow and you think you need one, well, now's the time to start thinking about that. And you'd be surprised at how many informal content governance and workflows there are. So do you even have that documented before you're meeting with a vendor, or you're starting to plan out your migration strategy? Next slide.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we've seen with clients is that, you know, if you build a site in, say, 2014, your content governance may have been perfect for then, but it's obviously evolved a lot in 6 years, and it's probably much more complicated now. And if you didn't have, you know, the level of developer support you needed on the site, a lot of your content workflows might have sort of evolved around what was in Drupal 7 instead of through Drupal 7, as kind of Aaron was pointing to about informal workflows. And it's just, you know, make sure that you actually know what the workflows are in real life versus what might actually work through your current CMS, because we've seen that a lot of those workflows actually end up in email in the real world. And, you know, the idea then here is to get them into the CMS when you're doing the major upgrade. Another thing that we tend to find is that there's a temptation to over create workflows. A lot of times folks will design a sophisticated workflow, and then once folks start using it, they just try and figure out how to work around it. So good thing to keep in mind as well, that the folks that are actually using it are the ones that are going to decide how useful it is or not. Yeah, which is a big point in favor of making sure we get their input. You get their input up front. Don't, you know, if you're on the, you know, the CMS team, for example, don't assume you know what the content editors in a remote office want and need. Make sure you ask them. Do you want to speak to these slides? Yeah, I mean, the reality is we could probably do a 45-minute session just on trying to estimate the level of effort of these things. It's kind of what I do for a living. So there's a couple of blog posts. And by the way, neither of these blog posts are actually Promet blog posts. They're from 2 other agencies. You know, great thing about open source, obviously, is we can borrow from our competitors and our friends. So there's a couple of both these blog posts have sort of a different approach to estimating out, you know, what just the content migration piece is going to be. This isn't like the whole site build. These 2 links are purely just on, okay, now we got to get, you know, 10,000 nodes of content from point A to point B. And they have 2 pretty different approaches. And I have used them both multiple times, and they generally end up pretty close to the same place. So they're either both really good or both really bad, depending on how you want to look at it. The reality is, when you actually do a major Drupal website build project, the migration isn't, you know, the content migration part isn't as distinct an effort as you like want to think about it as upfront. So it's kind of hard to decide later on, did we spend 250 hours or 280 hours on migration? So a lot of those pieces kind of end up running together. But from what I can tell, both these blog posts kind of come up in two different directions and end up in the same place, which I think is a pretty good sign that they're a pretty good, at least first order kind of estimate on the level of effort that's going to be involved. And they both kind of, they both basically are asking you to sort of, again, break down the migration into its component pieces, blocks and views and so forth, where the content is sitting now, and then, try to think about, understand where it's going to sit in the new site, and then give some guidelines for how long these agencies have seen that it takes to go from point A to point B.
So after you've done a content audit, you've got your content strategy down, and you are have some of your other planning done. You have an idea of the workflows and the content governance. You're going to create your new content model. Typically, it would be great if you had already solved that in Drupal 7 and you're going to use the exact same content types and fields, but I don't think that's ever actually happened. And these types of projects tend to be a time for organizations to kind of be self-reflective about this kind of thing. So what you're looking at is a mind map of a Drupal content model. This is one that we did recently with a large county level client. I've included a link to one out of the a simpler one that's Drupal 8 out of the box. If you go to the next slide, you can see that this is what you get with Drupal 8 out of the box. So on the right, you have your content types, the article, the basic page, taxonomy, media types, and blocks. This is basically a visual representation of what you'll probably end up doing in a spreadsheet. Some folks love spreadsheets. I kind of like spreadsheets. They match the way I think. But if you enjoy a video that might be useful for your team, this is a good tool for that. So once you've decided on what your and again, the content model is what gives your media entities, terms, etc. Map what you had in your old site or to Drupal 8. What you're looking at is a migration spreadsheet that Phase 2 has published, and involves writing out what the types are, and then mapping your previous content model to your new one. Promet also has a useful tool as well that we've linked to. And this is something that you can use to do the initial planning, but during the migration, as you are starting to move over different parts of the content, you can use these tools to help track that. And it's rare that that the new content model is fully fleshed out during this process. So this can be a living document that works alongside your Agile process as you build a new site. As you start to run migrations, you can iterate on that process. The initial migration is something I'm describing as your development team first getting in the weeds, creating a migration module and doing just the lightest possible migration. It's recommended to really do that as soon as possible. Once you actually start the work, that's when you can actually get a real feel for how long this is going to take and what the data actually looks like. It's often that you'll be getting access to the data in ways that you might not expect. Are you actually going to get the access you thought? Is it as structured as you thought? If you're going from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, there's less risk involved, but again, you might finally get access to the site and find that there's not the fields that you thought, or that the data wasn't stored in the way that you thought, or it's not coming over as you thought. And that's so the sooner that you can start to iterate on that work, the sooner you're going to get a better sense of what the development part of the content migration is actually going to look like. Then on the other end of a content migration is the actual site building. It's really rare that the migration is going to fulfill all of the site building needs that the data is going to map over to the new content model in a way that kind of builds the whole site, especially with tools like Layout Builder and content blocks, or even paragraphs. There's often going to be a manual component to the final site build. So getting a sense of that is going to give you a sense of how long the migration is going to take. And if you expect that that's going to be a big component of the site, then that can help inform your planning in terms of when you might expect to get QA of the front end or the back end, or both. So speaking of QA and training, in terms of your design and plan, a couple of kind of key milestones are when can you get the content editors actually into the new site? When can they start to test the workflows that you're looking at? When can they look at the new tools and give you feedback about that, so that you aren't surprised on launch day or soon after launch that that folks that are actually using the site to edit and create content or don't have the experience that you expected. And then how are you often you're not going to have an opportunity to QA every single page. Are there some tools that you can use to QA once the content is moved over? A link checker, broken link checker, that type of thing is something that you might want to add to your project plan. Next slide. Finally, at launch date, are you going to have a content cutoff date when folks can no longer edit the old site and are moving over to the new site? How is that going to affect your your content publishing. Some folks, that might not be a problem, or you might not be frequently updating content, so that date isn't super critical. But if you're publishing frequently, then that's something that you're going to want to really pay attention to in terms of that planning. And yeah, you want to check that new users have all the tools that they need before you go to launch. There was a question from Michael: is there a guideline for performing an LOE on migration of custom modules? That's a great question. We often look at that from like a feature perspective. What is and you're almost looking at it from scratch in some ways. If you had a registration system or a form system, what module or modules are going to get you close to what you want in Drupal 8? And yeah, since, as Chris said, it's a rewrite, a lot of those might or might not exist in core now, and a lot of them, there might be a paradigm shift in terms of how they might have being created now. You know, if you were using comments before in 2011, maybe you would use discuss in 2020 as an example. A follow-up question: are there best practices, lessons learned, or patterns for rewriting custom D7 code? There are, if you're following best practices, that's kind of all just, I guess, always the paradigm that I approach development from. In terms of the actual coding, I'm not sure there's like a one-to-one ratio or kind of function-to-function mapping. There are a couple modules. I think one's maybe called Deadwood. I'll have to look that up. That will make suggestions in terms of what if you're using hooks in Drupal 7, what the Drupal 8 version might be. But I think a lot of the value that you get from having a previous version of a module is the actual user experience of it. What are the actual features that users are using from it? I think that guiding the development can make your process a lot more streamlined if you kind of know what people are actually using. And in terms of Ray asks, is there a specific tool for testing migration? The migrate module in itself has a lot of tooling in terms of being able to roll back migrations. That's really useful. A link checker service, in terms of like the output, a link checker service would be useful. I might have to think about that question, Ray, and come up with a list that I could share with the group. Next slide.
Okay, I think it's the last slide. So,
Mm-hmm.
So this is just a some migration related blog posts that I've bookmarked over the last couple of years that might be helpful. Again, not all Promet. Although the bottom one I wrote personally, so you should definitely click on that
That's
link.
my favorite titled one.
But yeah, but just again, just there's I think Promet's 3 of those, and there's 2 other agencies in those links too. So there's just some different perspectives on things to think about with migration from a couple of different agencies, because I mean, we think we're good at Promet, but we don't have all the answers, not yet anyway.
No, and that's the fun thing about Drupal is you're collaborating with people that are you know, outside of your specific clan or group.
And then there's our contact info.
So in terms of the links listed, we'll be sharing the slides, and you can actually click through those our links in the slides themselves.
Nika has got the share link already in her email, so feel free to share that around.
Yes, we will. Thank you so much, Chris and Aaron. So there were 2 questions.
Did we get through all the questions, Aaron?
No. So
okay.
there were 2. The first one was, what do you recommend for a broken link checker?
Do you use Screaming Frog for that?
Yeah, as tool, it's not much for like a single user. I think it's like $50 a month. And there's also Google Webmaster Tools. If your site's been well indexed, or you get your site indexed, you can get it to index the site. It's kind of hard with the dev site on Drupal 8, obviously, before you launch it to get it indexed. So you might want to use Screaming Frog, but your links before you migrate, then Google Webmaster Tool should probably, if you have Google Analytics going, should probably already have that for you. Those are the 2 main ones we use. There is no link checker tool in Drupal 8. I know there was a module in Drupal 7, but last time I looked, nobody was trying to move that to 8.
The second question, what about government sites that may need to keep older content as a public record, even if it isn't?
So that's part of your content strategy, and would inform your prioritization and your kind of migration strategy. One key question often is do you need to preserve links? For some folks, if you have all new links, you'll take a dip in SEO, but if you're you know, a government entity, that might not matter for you, so it might not be worth the kind of additional effort to preserve those. But if SEO is a driver of your value, then that would be a higher priority. Sally asks, is the 8 to 9 migration seamless? If your development team is preparing by not using deprecated functions, then that it should be. That's the kind of promise of the new Drupal release paradigm.
Yeah, there's no new functionality after 8.9. So in theory, again, if you've only used modules that are already Drupal 9 ready, in theory, 8.9 to 9 should be no different than 8.8 to 8.9, 8.7 to 8.8. And I'll stress in theory, because this is the future we're talking about. We don't really know.
I see another question. Any suggestions for how to migrate D7 location fields, not address fields, to D8 address field?
I don't offhand, but I'll have to look that up.
Okay.
I know that the address fields are, and the suite of geolocation modules are supported basically. So you will have an upgrade path to some degree.
And best method for migrating field collections and paragraphs, any helper modules?
There is a migrate module that does have a plugin for paragraphs. I'll have to Google that right now. I'll chat it in just a second. I think it might be Migrate Plus.
Okay, so any more questions? Someone said, I found a patch to paragraphs module that handled this very well. And they are trying to post.
In terms of, so there's a question, how would you recommend agencies justifying migrating Drupal 8 to 9 outside of the fact that D7 will not be supported? I don't know, Chris, you are more often in that position.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest driver obviously is maintaining support, because that's a huge component of security. But also, if you think about it, Drupal 7 was sort of built on Drupal 6, and back then people weren't thinking about Drupal as a CMS that was going to support 250,000 pages and be sort of an enterprise central focal point of content management for a large government agency or a large corporation or whatever. It wasn't just never, we weren't thinking about it that way back then. So it was all rewritten from the ground up to support a more of an enterprise focus. So again, if you're a big huge federal agency or even a big state agency, you are a big enterprise. So Drupal 8 is built with you in mind, or Drupal 8 /9. In addition, Drupal 8, Drupal 9 are mobile friendly out of the box. 7, you kind of had to build that in yourself because back in 2013 we weren't too worried about mobile phones and websites that much yet. Drupal 8 and 9 also obviously has got much more of a an API approach, so that as you're thinking again in the future of whatever you're doing with content in your agency, maybe you're going to be pushing content out to mobile applications, to digital screens, dealing with content to Alexa and Google Home and audio type devices. All that type of work is going to be much, much easier in Drupal 8 than it will be in Drupal 7. It's because Drupal 8 sort of was built with the idea that it's going to be a content repository, and quite frankly, Drupal doesn't even care if you're using a Drupal theming layer. The whole headless Drupal thing where you can build your own front ends, and that might be something that we haven't even thought about yet.
Yeah, and I think how you're using Drupal can help articulate like the feature value. If you're using if you're using APIs heavily, that's something that has much better supported in Drupal 8.
All right. Well, thank you again, Chris and Aaron, for hosting February's webinar. So after this webinar, we will send out a survey form to fill out. Please fill that out so that we can receive the feedback and improve. And be on the lookout for our next webinar in March, which will be on divergent thinking.
And my email address is there, and so if you have a question about something today, your question didn't get answered, feel free to shoot me an email. This is Chris.
So I also see two
we'll try to get it answered.
Questions. So D8 also has built-in accessibility that D7 doesn't. How heavily should presentation be split from backend?
I'm happy to keep talking for a little bit.
Go ahead. We have until 4 o'clock.
Oh, okay. I thought we ended at 3:45. So in terms of presentation from backend, I mean, I think it's helpful to think in terms of the migration, to make that distinction. The way that you design the new Drupal 8 site, thinking of the distinction between how the data is stored and how you're presenting it on on the screen, I think, can make doing both the storage and the presentation better. One of the things that we're starting to try and use more are design systems. So the atomic design paradigm is something that we've been using more, and that kind of separates the presentation into smaller, more reusable chunks. And that makes our job a little bit more mapping the backend to the design system, something that is more based around the value that the design is trying to present to the user, as opposed to just kind of like, all right, how do you make these Drupalisms like content types and fields and views? How do you kind of slap some CSS on them and try and make them work for the user? So I think design systems are helping us in utilizing that difference between the back and the front end. In terms of accessibility, that's something that we're baking much more into our projects, both in terms of tooling testing, but accessibility reviews. So if you leave accessibility considerations on the front end till the end of the project, you're less likely to come up with solutions that are as valuable for folks that are using alternative means to access the site. So that's something that, from a programmatic perspective, we're trying to bake into the process throughout the design and site build.
Okay. I think we're coming to the end. So you see the email addresses for both. So I assume they can reach out if they have any questions or concerns.
Yep, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, happy to hear from anyone. Any questions that you're asking help get my gears going. So.
And we'll be sharing your slides, and we'll post also this webinar. Thank you again. Thank you everybody else for joining.
Thanks.
All right, thanks everybody for attending.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.